This is Euronews Now. Here are your top stories. International condemnation after Russia gives death sentences to 2 Britons and 1 Moroccan national captured while fighting for Ukraine. The British Foreign Secretary calls the trial a sham.
January 6th was the culmination of an attempted coup.
Graphic testimony from the hearings on Capitol Hill as the US House of Representatives investigates the deadly assault on the seat of democracy aimed at overturning the results of the 2020 presidential election.
Here in theCUBE, we take a closer look at a so-called gold card linked to the former US President, Donald Trump.
And France gears up for the first round of the parliamentary elections, with President Macron hoping to win a majority to push through his policies. I'm Helena Humphrey. It's good to have you with us. The UK has slammed Moscow for giving a death sentence to 2 British fighters captured while fighting for Ukraine. A Moroccan national has also been sentenced. Well, the 3 fighters were tried in what has been described as a proxy court in Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine on Thursday. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says that the judgment is a sham and says that she's working with her Ukrainian counterpart to secure their release. The UK's Defence Secretary has also arrived in Kyiv for talks with the country's president. But the Kremlin's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, says that Donetsk People's Republic and not Russia is responsible for the conviction, while labelling Number 10's reaction as hysterical. Well, for more on the trial, I spoke to Wayne Jordash in Kyiv. He is the managing partner of Global Rights Compliance law firm, and he updated me on the status of these men.
Well, the situation remains as is, which is that after a trial which lasted shockingly less than 3 days, the men have been sentenced to death, despite the fact that they're clearly part of the Ukrainian army, clearly not mercenaries, and clearly were found or surrendered in Mariupol, where they'd been defending against Russia's aggression. So Liz Truss, the Foreign Ministry Minister of the UK's assessment of the trial as sham is correct. It's accurate, and that's where we are.
Talk to us a little bit more about the legality, the fact that this hasn't been a internationally recognised conviction. It's a violation of the Geneva Convention. Tell us more about that.
Well, Geneva Convention 3 essentially means that if they're part of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is what they were, whether they're volunteers or actually recruited members of the Ukrainian armed forces, then they are prisoners of war. And as such, they have combat immunity. That means they can't be prosecuted for participating in the conflict, participating by defending, let's say, in Mariupol. They are entitled to fight, to defend for the Ukrainians. Now, what the Russians say is, well, they were mercenaries. But if that's correct, then they have to prove that the men were not part of the Ukrainian army, that they were not resident in Ukraine, and that they were receiving funds which are in excess of what the Ukrainian army recruits and military are receiving, and none of that has been demonstrated, and none of it can be demonstrated. It just beggars belief, to be honest. So it's unlawful to put them on trial, and if, let's say, they were put on trial for violating IHL, that is, committing war crimes, then the trial has to be fair. Willfully denying them a fair trial is a war crime in itself, and there's no doubt that Russia is responsible for that.
Well, there are many theories as to Russia's actions and aims in all of this, whether, for example, President Putin could be trying to extract something from the UK, concessions in this, whether he could be using it for a potential prisoner swap. What do you think?
I think that's crystal clear. I think Putin understands that he cannot win this war fairly through military means. That's been demonstrated by the Ukrainians time and time again. If they have weapons, they can defeat the Russians. That seems clear. So Putin falls back on his usual playbook, which is to coerce, to blackmail, to use dishonest means to achieve his political aims. And so British hostages are an important part of that. He can use them to negotiate for the release of his prisoners or for other geopolitical aims. It is Putin's way.
So, Wayne, if these men are being used and held as hostages, then where does that leave them in their fates? And in terms of the UK and trying to secure their release, what wiggle room, what possibility is there to see these men free?
Well, there's no wiggle room in terms of using the law, that's for sure, because this is a regime that ignores international law. But there is wiggle room, I would say, if the West, including the UK, but particularly the UK, applies pressure and makes it very clear to Russia that if these men are executed, that Russia, Putin and his entourage will pay consequences for that, whether legally or whether diplomatically, whether sanctions-wise and so on. That's the only room there is now for wriggle.
Well, Ukraine's authorities are warning that war-ravaged Mariupol in the south of the country is on the brink of a cholera outbreak. The city's mayor says that corpses are contaminating limited supplies of drinking water and prompting the spread of the deadly bacterial disease. There are fears that thousands of residents could die from infectious diseases by the end of the year. Meanwhile, Ukraine's deputy head of military intelligence has pleaded with the West to send more ammunition. He said defending troops are solely reliant on donated weapons and insisted that supplies on the front lines are running desperately low. French voters will head back to the polls on Sunday for the country's parliamentary elections just 2 months after President Emmanuel Macron was re-elected. Allies of the president are seeking to retain a majority in the face of an increasingly competitive challenge from the new left-wing coalition. Well, the ballot could provide Macron the parliamentary power that he needs to deliver on his election promise of a transformative new era for France. But the shape of the new parliament will only become clear after the second round of votes, and that is 1 week later. Well, let's bring in our reporter in Paris now, David Chazan. David, Macron hasn't had very long to catch his breath after those presidential elections, I should say, but he'll be needing a majority if he wants to be able to put his plans, his vision for the country into action. Do you think that he's going to get what he needs?
Well, I think this is certainly going to be a very close-run election. The opinion polls are placing President Macron's centrist bloc neck and neck with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is a far-left leader, with his left-wing alliance. And in fact, one recent poll even put the leftist alliance very slightly ahead of Mr. Macron's bloc. So that's causing a degree of concern in Mr. Macron's camp. They are worried about this. In the presidential election, his main opponent was the far-right leader, Marine Le Pen. This time, it's Jean-Luc Mélenchon who is proclaiming that this is the election that will make him Prime Minister, because if his group were to win a parliamentary majority, then President Macron might be obliged to appoint him Prime Minister. That seems unlikely for now, but what they may do is win enough votes to deprive Mr. Macron's group of that parliamentary majority, which, as you said, he needs to be able to govern effectively.
But let's touch on the left then, because as you say, if the left does make gains, there is the possibility that we could see Jean-Luc Mélenchon become Prime Minister. And I just wonder, what is attracting people now to this left coalition in this particular vote when, you know, just a few months ago, we saw Jean-Luc Mélenchon come in third in this presidential race?
Yes, well, what's changed is that since the presidential election, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party has managed to form an alliance with the socialists, the communists and the Greens. So that gives them broader appeal than Mr. Mélenchon had in the presidential election. So the parliamentary result could potentially be much better for Mr. Mélenchon than the presidential one. But one potential pitfall for Mr. Mélenchon is that left-wing supporters tend to be fairly young people who are less likely to turn out to vote than older people, more of whom support Mr. Macron.
If Macron doesn't get his majority, where does this leave his vision for the country? You know, what policies could be stalled by this?
Well, one policy that Mr. Macron might have trouble putting through if he fails to win a parliamentary majority is his plan to lower the pension age from 62 to 60. And he might find that he's spending most of his time fighting off Mr. Mélenchon's attempts to put his radical left policies through. So Mr. Mélenchon actually wants to lower the pension age from 62 to 60. He wants to increase the minimum wage, and he's got a whole raft of what Mr. Macron terms classic tax and spend leftist policies, which Conservatives and Mr. Macron argue would end up bankrupting France.
All right, David Chazan there reporting from Paris ahead of the first round of the parliamentary elections here in France on Sunday. David, thanks a lot. Well, the French Football Federation says that CCTV footage of the chaotic scenes outside of the Champions League final has been deleted. Police used tear gas and pepper spray on Liverpool fans, including children, as they attempted to gain entry to the Stade de France for last month's match. Now, a spokesperson confirmed that the footage had been automatically deleted after a week because the French police had made no request to seize the tapes. Defence ministers from the US and China exchanged frosty words over the issue of Taiwan as the pair met face-to-face for the first time earlier. Speaking at the summit in Singapore, US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin accused Beijing of interfering in the affairs of its democratic neighbour. Beijing says the US is fuelling tensions in the region by selling weapons to Taiwan. Last month, President Biden told reporters in Tokyo that the US would respond militarily if China were to try to take Taiwan by force.